I'm seeing a lot of orange Bibles around here, so it sounds like everybody's getting the right Bible now. They all seem to be orange. I don't know why they want to put an orange cover on all of them. It's all right with me. I don't have any problem one way or the other what color they are. But when it's this night of the week, there's a lot of orange Bibles floating around. Well, we were outlining Maccabees, second Maccabees, and in the process we were going over a few things in the various chapters. We said there's 3 divisions for the book. Chapters 1 and 2 give us the introduction, which is made up of 3 parts. 2 letters sent by the Jews in Jerusalem to the Jews in Egypt. The first one found from verse 1 to verse 9 of chapter 1, and then 1:10 through 2:18. And then the third part of this first section, the first 2 chapters, would be verses 19 through 32 of chapter 2, which tells us that he's summing up in just a few chapters here this 5-volume work done by one unknown Jason of Cyrene. And then in chapters 3 through 7, which is where we were, we have pre-Maccabean history. Now, first Maccabees, we said, covered a 40-year period from 175 to 135 BC. Just half of that amount of time is covered by second Maccabees, and only about 15 years of the same period that's in first Maccabees to second Maccabees overlap, which would be 175 to 160. But the book goes back, according to chapter 3, which is what would be on right now, to 180 BC, during the reign of S4 Philopater, and he's got this well-known military figure, Heliodorus, who's gone to take the treasury from the temple in Jerusalem. This is where we saw the ridiculous account of the horses sicked by the angels on Heliodorus. They hoofed him into submission, and he went back and told Seleucus there's a divine power that surrounds the temple. Should have said there are a lot of horses that surround the temple, and we're not going back there. Then in chapter 4, now if you got your charts, which I trust you do, open up again on your chart. We're talking in Maccabees about this period right here on your chart, right here. It's in the center of the page vertically and to the far right horizontally. Now, the author of the chart has the high priest set up on this gray line, this gray bar that horizontally runs the length from left to right 3 different times on the chart. It's divided up vertically, the parts 1, 2, and 3. But you go down to the far right horizontally, the middle of the page vertically, anywhere from, say, around 200 BC down to 140. And there you see Onias III, Jason, look on the gray bar, Onias III, Jason, Menelaus, Jason, Alcimus. Beneath him you see Judas and Jonathan, but they're placed there not as high priests but as military leaders. And then you get down to 153, and all of a sudden Jonathan is raised up higher on the line instead of down low, which means he assumed the high priesthood, and he was military political commander as well. So the period we're concerned about, and it's really not all chronologically right in 2nd Maccabees, but anyway, the period that we're concerned about would be where you see Jason, then there's the Menelaus, Pauls, and then Jason again. They've got here on the chart Menelaus just for at least a few months out of the year, maybe the whole year, 171. According to 2nd Maccabees, which would certainly be the least reliable of the two if you wanted to believe either your chart or 2nd Maccabees, he comes on the scene and he lasts a little bit longer, and he comes on the scene at different times as opposed to just this one period here. Well, there's a note there, the end of the Zadokite priesthood. I don't guess we want to get into that right now. But Menelaus is not from the same family as Jason. Jason was a brother of Onias. Menelaus, if you look under Onias, you see, we're really under Simon II. You see the house of Tobias. You see some descendants like Simon. He's one of the ones we're talking about in these chapters. Hyrcanus, that's a different fellow besides John Hyrcanus. He's even spoken of here in the book somewhere. I think we came across his name before. In chapter 3, verse 11, he's called Hyrcanus, the son of Tobias. Probably just means he's a descendant. But anyway, this Menelaus that we're talking about is related to this Simon, which comes from the house of Tobias, which is not on the line, which means that we're out of the Zadokite line for the priesthood, according to the appointing of King David, Zadok, the high priest, during his time. But you have to go back to 1 Samuel 2, I think 1 Kings 2, to understand something about the high priesthood, how it's gone from one of the descendants of Aaron to another one of the descendants. But anyway, there's where we're talking about here in these, well, we're in chapter 4. Jason, Menelaus, Jason. Because what we have, first of all, Onias the third is the high priest in chapter 4. Then Jason, who is his brother, but who's wicked in comparison to his elder brother Onias, goes before Antiochus Epiphanes and buys the high priesthood away from Onias. And then he doesn't have it very long until down in verse 23, and Menelaus goes and outbids Jason for the high priesthood. So you can tell we've got a lot of corrupt times in Israel right now, where people are seeing who can pay the most to obtain the high priesthood. Now all that's important because we start with chapter 5, which is where we're going to start now, because we've got some serious problems that result in Israel just because of this bickering and bribing going on to obtain the high priesthood. So I want to divide up a little bit of chapter 5, not the whole thing, but it's important because really the book of Maccabees hinges historically, politically, militarily upon first 3 quarters of chapter 5. The first 4 verses, we've read this before when we looked at the aberrations that are seen in the book, but the first 4 verses give us this 40-day period of apparitions that are seen in the sky over Jerusalem. Starting there in verse 2. Apparitions were seen in the sky all over Jerusalem for nearly 40 days. Galloping horsemen in golden armor, companies of spearmen standing to arms, swords unsheathed, cavalry divisions in battle order. Charges and countercharges were made on each side. Shields were shaken, spears, massed, javelins hurled, breastplates and golden ornaments of every kind shone brightly. And all men prayed, that is, all men in Jerusalem prayed, that this apparition might portend or might predict, might be for good. And it turns to be just the opposite. Evidently, what this is meant to be, of course, Maccabees, the writer, is supposedly just giving us a history, so he tells us what the people are praying for. They want it to mean good for the city. But evidently, the reason he stuck this in here is to show God's displeasure with the religious hierarchy and political hierarchy in Israel at this time, seen in the bidding and bribing for the high priesthood. So that really, he has to say that, and he says that all men pray that this would be for good, but he's going to go on to show us in the chapter that really it was a portend of something evil to come and not something good. So the next verse, verse 5, down through verse 10, gives us the history of Jason now trying to retake the high priesthood from Menelaus. We end chapter 4 with Menelaus still being high priest. So upon a false report of Antiochus' death, Jason collected no less than 1,000 men and made a surprise attack on Jerusalem. You see, this helps you understand the book better because you know who these people are. Jason is not an enemy as far as being a Syrian or a Seleucid, but he's a Jew. But he's one who's been out-bribed for the high priesthood, and so now he's going to try to take it back by force. Because he thinks Antiochus is dead, a false report, the author said. The defenders on the wall were driven back, and the city was finally taken. Menelaus took refuge in the citadel, and Jason continued to massacre his fellow citizens without pity. Verse 7, however, he didn't gain control of the government. He only gained dishonor as a result of his plot and returned again as a fugitive to Ammonite territory, which is a familiar name from your Old Testament. He goes on to die. I think we might come back and look at that if we have time later on. But he goes on to die. Then starting with verse 11, down through verse 16, what we have here is a misinterpretation by Antiochus Epiphanes, the one thought to be dead by Jason in verse 5, concerning what's going on in Jerusalem since someone has attacked the city. And he has reports sent back to him. You see, he's not there on the scene. He doesn't know that it's one high priest trying to take over from another high priest. But the report that he gets is that we've got a revolt, a rebellion going on in Jerusalem. So he interprets that to mean they're revolting against his rule. And so, evidently, 2 Maccabees, the author, intends for us to date this around 168 BC. When news of this, verse 11, reached the king, it became clear to him that Judea was in a state of rebellion. Evidently, the writer means for us to understand that Antiochus took this to be a charge of his kingship. So he set out from Egypt in a savage mood and took Jerusalem by storm, and ordered his troops to cut down without mercy everyone they met, and to slaughter those who took refuge in the houses. Young and old were murdered, women and children massacred, girls and infants butchered. At the end of 3 days, their losses had amounted to 80,000, 40,000 killed in action, and as many sold into slavery. Not satisfied with this, the king had the audacity to enter the holiest temple on earth, guided by Menelaus. Jason's dead. Menelaus is still in control. He ends up dead before too long in the book, though, who had turned traitor both to his religion and his country. Remember, this is a pious Pharisee, or one that has Pharisaic tendencies, writing the book. So he really, whenever he has the opportunity to really tell it like it is, and he does. He said this fellow turned traitor to his religion and to his country. He goes on saying that he desecrated the temple. And then verses 17 through 20. So you see, this is really going to set the stage for the whole Maccabean revolt. Now he's finally taken the city. Instead of just being recognized officially as king over Israel and Jerusalem, he's actually taken the city by force, massacred these 40,000 people, and worst things of all, he's gone into the temple now. And so this is why he has to introduce this, to tell us why the Maccabees, like we're going to get to that down in verse 27, come on the scene. And yet one thing, you can see he's a good writer. He's a good thinker, what he's doing. Remember we read back in chapter 3, and I just mentioned it again this evening when we first began, how those horses were sent by the angels to trot upon this Heliodorus back in chapter 3 because he had dared not to go in, but just to take something, the treasury, from the Lord's temple. And yet we know Antiochus doesn't die for killing the people, for taking the city, and we'd certainly think that he was going to die if he went into the holiest of all, and yet he doesn't die. And so the author of 2 Maccabees knows he's got to explain that some way. Why did Heliodorus, why was he allowed to survive when he did something far less than did Antiochus Epiphanes? So he's going to tell us why. The pride of Antiochus passed all bounds. He did not understand, and here's where he tells us, he did not understand that the sins of the people of Jerusalem had angered the Lord for a short time, and that this was why he left the temple to its fate. That's the only reason that God left the temple to Antiochus and left Antiochus in one piece for going in the temple. If they had not already been guilty of many sinful acts, Antiochus would have fared like Heliodorus. You see, he's telling us why he didn't have all of these horses sent out after him like Heliodorus had. Who was sent by King Seleucus to inspect the treasury. Well, to inspect it, to take the treasury. Like him, he would have been beaten by these horses. But the Lord did not choose the nation for the sake of the sanctuary, but chose the sanctuary for the sake of the nation. By the way, some people think they find parallels over in the New Testament to phrases here. What does that remind you of? Anything in particular? It just stands out to me. That's why I remember it. I'm not going to go over all of the alleged parallels. Well, remember that time Jesus said that man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. That kind of sounds a lot like this. So they say, well, Jesus got that from this. Well, he didn't borrow anything out of 2 Maccabees. There's too much heresy in here to be borrowing anything out of it. Okay, then chapters 6 and 7, we just lumped together. We're still under this second division of chapters 3 to 7. Chapters 6 and 7 just detail some of the Jewish persecutions. I think I'll pick out a couple of verses, 10 and 11 of chapter 6, just to show you some of the things that are going on. But chapters 6 and 7 detail some of the various persecutions experienced immediately after Antiochus Epiphanes enters into Jerusalem and the temple. For instance, chapter 6 and verse 10. Their miserable fate was there for all to see, Israel. For instance, 2 women were brought to trial for having their children circumcised. Remember, this is one of the things that was forbidden of the people. They were paraded through the city with their babies hanging at their breasts and then flung down from the fortifications. Evidently, he means off the wall. Other Jews had assembled in caves near Jerusalem to keep the Sabbath in secret. They were denounced to Philip and were burnt alive, since they scrupled to defend themselves out of regard for the holiness of the day. Again, shows the Pharisaic tendencies. All of chapter 7, which is the most famous chapter in 2 Maccabees and in all of the Apocrypha, and for that purpose, we're not going to look at it now. We're going to look at how it's been used and interpreted whenever we finish looking at all of the books individually, the impact of the Apocrypha on society's religious beliefs, its writings, poetry, literature, and so forth. But all of chapter 7 concerns this pious Jewish woman, and I believe the 7 sons that she had. I forget the number. It doesn't make any difference, but I believe it was 7 sons. That'd be a good, perfect, sacred number to use in a Jewish book. Now, they were all one at a time, beginning with 1 son through all 7, and finally to the mother, brought before the king and given a chance to recant their religion and so forth. And they all die very, very terrible, horrible deaths. You ought to read the chapter if you haven't. That'd be the one chapter to read. They all died very horrible deaths as martyrs for the cause of Israel. By the way, what does that remind you of? The Sadducees, remember that account about resurrection from the dead? This woman had 7 husbands, and she had them one in order, and then finally she died. See, they think they find parallels. If you don't watch out and you're a liberal scholar or you're a pupil of a liberal scholar, you say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But just because we've got the number 7 doesn't mean anything. There could be a lot of parallels like that. But they jump at things like that and say we've got parallels, that Jesus and the apostles used the Apocrypha to fortify their doctrine. They didn't need to. They had the whole Old Testament to do all the fortifying they needed to. And they used it a lot, several hundred quotations, just in a few little short books over in the New Testament, taken from the Old. Verse 28 is an interesting verse. This is the clearest reference in all of the Apocrypha, and the clearest, by the way, in all of the Old Testament, if you want to include all of it together, which of course we don't. But it's the clearest reference to the Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing. Now you have it very clearly over in Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen are not made of things which do appear. Creation from nothing, the Latin means. And here's the clearest statement in the Apocrypha, or in all the Old Testament if you were of the mind to lump them together. Here the mother is encouraging and exhorting one of her sons just before he dies. And she says, I beg you, child, look at the sky and the earth. See all that is in them and realize that God made them out of nothing. Well, of course, the account is Genesis 1. But it's stated very plainly. It's stated almost in a New Testament fashion here when it says that God made them out of nothing. Okay, then chapters 8 through 15. This is the final and third section. Chapters 8 through 15 parallels 1 Maccabees 3 through 7, which gives us the victories of Judas Maccabeus. 1 Maccabees, remember, covers Judas, Jonathan, Simon, and John. Second Maccabees only deals with Judas Maccabeus down to his death around 161, 160 BC. Now, in the next thing that we're fixing to do, we'll probably look at some various verses in these chapters, so I'm not going to point a lot out, but here's where we've got the part of Second Maccabees that would parallel First Maccabees. So there's an outline and a brief understanding of the book. Next in order is to look at the errors, the fallacies of Second Maccabees. You see, there are no faults in the Word of God, because since it's inspired by the all-wise, all-knowing, almighty God, he couldn't have been wrong in what he had written down. So if we find a lot of things wrong here, it means it wasn't inspired by God. We said that we're always going to point out various things in the book. Some of them are more pronounced than others. Like back in 1 Esdras, we had chapter 3 through chapter 5 and verse 6 give us this Persian tale of the three guardsmen, which is very mythical and very mystical. And for anyone who knows the inspired Word of God, you compare that with the Scriptures, you can tell that's not of God right away. But at the same time, you can't really say, well, this is a false statement here, or this is chronologically incorrect, or something like that. So I think that we pointed out with 1 Esdras that there are many, many internal differences between 1 Esdras and our book of Ezra. Just that I didn't think we needed to take the time, nor did I want to take the time, to point out all of these little tiny minor things where names were reversed and various things like this. So suffice that as an example of errors in 1 Esdras. In 1 Maccabees, we also said that there were minor slips in chronology, the politics, geographical locations, minor mistakes, but if they're a mistake, it's a mistake. It means it wasn't inspired by God. And again, I don't want to point out all of those, but I will show you one if you turn back to chapter 1 of 1 Maccabees. I'm reiterating this. I mentioned this before because I want you to have down something underneath each one of the books as being wrong with the book. So you'll have your ammunition with you. What's wrong with the book? There's not a lot wrong with 1 Maccabees. It just is giving us political, military history, not really trying to give it to us, slipping us a little religion under the table or anything like that. But even your best of writers, when they're not inspired, they're going to make mistakes. They can do all the research they want to, but since they don't know the minds and the hearts of all human beings, they're going to misquote someone somewhere. And all it takes, you could write a book today about George Washington, and guess what? The book won't be infallible. You're relying on records of what someone said. Maybe someone misquoted him to start with. And now that's going to be carried through all of these records. So the same is true with 1 Maccabees, verse 5 of chapter 1. This is a mistake. This is not the way power was transferred from Alexander to the four leaders that came after him of the Greek Empire. This is just not the way it happened. The time came when he, this is speaking now of Alexander the Great, when he fell ill, and knowing that he was dying, he summoned his generals, nobles who had been brought up with him from childhood, and divided his empire among them while he was still alive. That's a false statement. That's not the way the power was passed down. Alexander the Great died suddenly, and the kingdom kind of stayed stagnant for a little while until four men did scramble to grab different parts of Alexander's Greek empire, but they weren't partitioned out by Alexander on his deathbed before he gave up the ghost. So he just didn't know his history. He's not trying to tell us something wrong here. Remember that about 1 Maccabees. He's not trying to get anything wrong across like all of these other authors are in the Apocrypha. It's just that he made a mistake because his sources were in error. And since, you see, God is the source of the Word, and he's not in error, that means the Word's going to be exactly right. It all depends on who your source is. And so the source was wrong, which makes this part of 1 Maccabees wrong. And if any part of it is errant, then it's not inspired Scripture. That's the point we're making. We can find errors in the book, then they're not inspired Scripture. But 2 Maccabees, of the three books we've covered thus far, is the far more dangerous of the three, many more errors found in it, and the errors are much more important. So we're going to start spending some time this evening looking at the chronological, religious, and so forth errors of 2nd Maccabees. So let's start back in chapter 1. Look at a fictitious religious account here. And these are some of the things that you need to remember, because this is what proves the books to be so wrong. Even as I say there with 1st Maccabees, we're not criticizing the fellow who wrote the book. He just had some wrong information. But it's another thing when we come to 2nd Maccabees, and a different attempt is being made through the writing. So here's the first fault we're going to point out. According to the author of 2nd Maccabees, the sacred fire from the altar of the temple was preserved from Babylonian captivity all the way down to the time of Nehemiah. The sacred fire, the altar of burnt offering. Remember how it was lit supernaturally back in the Old Testament days? And it wasn't supposed to go out, and so if you've got captivity and it takes a long time for the people to get back, then how are you going to keep the fire going? Well, God had a supernatural method. He turned it into a thick, slimy, liquid substance and had someone hide it, and then in Nehemiah's day it was discovered and placed back on the altar. Yes, that's a true story according to 2nd Maccabees. Chapter 1, verses 19 through 23. You might want to turn to this if you've got your apocryphal Bible and look at it. It's very interesting. The sacred fire from the altar was preserved from the Babylonian captivity, 586 BC, or somewhat before that, all the way down to the time of the statesman Nehemiah, in this thick, gooey, liquid substance. Verse 19, when our fathers, 2nd Maccabees 1, when our fathers were carried away to Persia, well, there's a mistake right away. They weren't carried to Persia, they were carried to Babylon. Everybody knows that. Here's a blunder of the first order. And it's not like you could say, well, he's writing during the time of the Persians, and since the Persians followed the Babylonians, then when he said Persia, he meant Babylon, because we're not even in the Persian period. We're way down in the Greek period. Really beyond the Greek period. We're in the Seleucid period now. So there's a blunder of the first order when our fathers were carried off to Persia. You would never say that. They were carried off to Babylon. Well, there's a mistake right there. You can just tack that on because it's found in the context with this more interesting one of this liquid fire. I've never heard of liquid fire before. The pious priest of those days secretly took fire from the altar and concealed it in a dry well. It proved a safe hiding place and remained undiscovered. Undiscovered for a couple of centuries. After many years, you need to put in a couple of centuries there. He doesn't mean like 5 years later. Like you could have one of those rare pieces of wood that will burn for 5 years. Because this isn't wood, this is a liquid substance that stays fire. Sounds like hocus pocus to me. For many years had passed, in God's good time, Nehemiah was sent back by the king of Persia. He then dispatched the descendants of the priest who had hidden it to get the fire, and they informed our people that they found not fire, but a thick liquid. This is way down in the bottom of this dry well. Nehemiah ordered them to draw some out and bring it to him. When the materials of the sacrifice had been presented, he ordered the priest to sprinkle this liquid over the wood, the things laid upon it, and this was done. Some time passed, then the sun, which earlier had been hidden by clouds, shone out, and the altar burst into a great blaze, so that everyone marveled, as the sacrifice was burning and they offered up prayers. So you have a miracle here. First of all, in the hiding of this fire, and then it's transformed into liquid, they spread it on top of the sacrifice, and the rays of the sun hit it, and it's metamorphosized into fire all of a sudden, which is supposed to prove God's blessing upon the people because he gave them back their fire supernaturally. Well, we have Nehemiah officiating at a sacrificial ceremony here. I think only 2 times in the book of Nehemiah, in our book of Nehemiah, is the word sacrifice even mentioned. The first time's not important. It's found back in, I think, one of the early chapters. The only time that concerns Nehemiah is Nehemiah 12 and verse 43. Here's the only time we see Nehemiah around either a fire or a sacrifice, and there's no mentioning of this liquid substance at all. And if it was such a great miracle as this, the writers of the Bible are never hesitant to include the miracles of God, be they strange or not, and this is certainly an outstanding one. But they'd be the first included in here to show God's supernatural approval and protection of the people and preservation of his sacred fire that he'd given way back in the days of Solomon. Nehemiah 12 and verse 43. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, and God made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. There's no mentioning of this mythical account that we find here in the first chapter of 2 Maccabees. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, and God made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off. There's no mentioning of this mythical account that we find here in the first chapter of 2 Maccabees. Okay, a second fault, which is found in verse 18, just before the verses we started reading. Nehemiah is said to be the builder of the temple instead of Zerubbabel. Nehemiah is said to be the builder of the temple. Verse 18. Now the verse starts off with this little personal note in this second of the 2 letters to the Jews in Egypt from the Jews in Palestine to encourage them to keep the Feast of Dedication. We are about to celebrate the purification of the temple on the 25th of Kislev, and think it right to inform you so that you also, for your part, may celebrate a Feast of Tabernacles in honor of the fire which appeared when Nehemiah offered sacrifices. Well, Nehemiah never offered sacrifices. That was for the priest to do, after he had built the temple and the altar. Well, Nehemiah didn't do that either. So we've got a religious soul here, this is remarkable, who really doesn't know his Old Testament. If you're going to try to put something over, you have to know the material by which people are going to check your book out, and he simply doesn't know the Old Testament. Because, I mean, this was just common knowledge. It should have been to him. It was just common knowledge among the Jews, as well as among people who know anything about the Bible today. And yet he's making mistakes all over the place. A third mistake, I guess this is the most outstanding and most unusual of these historical mistakes that he has made. This is found in chapter 2, verses 1 to 8, where he tells us that by revelation, Jeremiah, the prophet, not only gave them this information about hiding the fire, which we've just read, but Jeremiah hides the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and the altar of incense from the Babylonians when they attacked the city in a cave on top of Mount Nebo, the mountain of Moses, where he saw the promised land in Deuteronomy 34. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard this story before. I've heard it before. I think I've mentioned it. I know I mentioned it when I was teaching back in the Bible school many years ago. And it's a very interesting account. And I've heard it even in charismatic circles. So I want to spend a little time looking at this to clear up in everyone's mind what the truth is about this statement. How many of you have heard that before? Jeremiah took the ark and hid it in a cave? Well, not as many as I thought. Well, here's the basis for it. 2 Maccabees 2, of all places. So let's read verses 1 to 8. I'm surprised more of you haven't heard that. I've heard it mentioned by people, kind of mentioned, if not taught, it's mentioned in such a way as though I gathered from them that they would like to believe the story, because it's very unusual, interesting account, that sacred altar of the covenant. or Ark of the Covenant, and the altar of incense. What happened to that? Because whenever we read in our Bible the books that were written after the exile, there's no mentioning of the Ark of the Covenant anymore. But yet that had been the most important thing for Israel, because whether she was in tabernacle or temple, she still had her ark, and God said, I am enthroned in your midst upon the ark. That was God's personal seat, as we could say, his personal place of abode and his personal residence. So it was very important. And yet we get into this struggle with Babylon from 605 to 586 BC between Israel and Babylon, and there's just no mentioning at all of the Ark of the Covenant and what took place with it. Well, he said the records show. I don't know what records. Must be the records of Jason of Cyrene. The records show, because it's not in our Bible, that the prophet Jeremiah, who ordered the exiles to hide the fire, as has been mentioned back in chapter 1, also that having given them the law, he charged them not to neglect the ordinances of the Lord, or to be led astray by the sight of images of gold and silver with all their finery. After, evidently, they get in Babylon, they would see these things. Similar words, he said, don't abandon the law. Further, this document records that, prompted by a divine message, the prophet gave orders that the tent of meeting and the ark should go with him. Then he went away to the mountain, from the top of which Moses saw God's promised land. And when he reached the mountain, Jeremiah found a cave dwelling. He carried the tent, the ark, and the incense altar into it, and then blocked up the entrance. Some of his companions came to mark out the way, but were unable to find it. When Jeremiah learned of this, he reprimanded them. The place shall remain unknown, Jeremiah said, until God finally gathers his people together and shows mercy to them. Then the Lord will bring these things to light again, and the glory of the Lord will appear with the cloud, as it was seen both in the time of Moses and when Solomon prayed that the shrine might be worthily consecrated. So Jeremiah said that he had a divine message to hide three items: the tent, or the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and the incense altar. And someone else tried to go find it afterwards, and they couldn't, and Jeremiah said, well, the reason that you can't is that God's hidden it in such a way so that no one's going to find it until the end times, until he gathers his people together and shows them mercy. And he said, whenever it is discovered, then we're going to have this great manifestation of the glory of God. Now, I say end times, not that that's what the author of 2nd Maccabees meant, but that's what a lot of people interpret today, that it's going to be found in the last days. He could simply have reference to them finding it whenever they get back from captivity, when God, verse 7, gathers his people together and shows mercy to them. Well, at least a partial manifestation of that can certainly be seen in the return of the exiles. But that doesn't satisfy people. A lot of people want to make this an end-time event. It's one of those things that we're supposed to be looking for as a sign of the times. Remember, however, it's nowhere in our canonical scriptures, though. It's found right here in 2nd Maccabees 2. What is in our canonical scriptures concerning the ark, though, is nothing. That's what's interesting about the whole matter. Why no reference to something as important as that, like in the end of Kings, or in the end of 2nd Chronicles, or in the end of Jeremiah? All three of those books are giving us the history of the fall of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. Well, I remember reading a couple of years ago in an archaeological magazine how back in the 1920s, a man by the name of Antonia Frederick Futterer, F-U-T-T-E-R-E-R, Antonia Frederick Futterer, had the unction, after reading 2nd Maccabees 2, verses 4 to 8, to go, he was an American, to go to Israel as an archaeologist and to search for the Ark of the Covenant. And the place to search, according to, verse 4, was Mount Nebo, which is where Moses viewed the Promised Land. He saw it, but he didn't get to set his foot in it, according to Deuteronomy chapter 34. He died there in the mount, and the Lord buried him, and no man knows of his sepulchre unto this day, the writer of the last chapter said. So after reading 2 Maccabees 2, he decided to go, and he went, found Mount Nebo. There's a church. Well, there's churches everywhere over there. Every place is a holy place. The Crusaders just built them left and right. There's a church right on top of Mount Nebo, and he found a secret passageway, so he said, that led underneath the mountain and wound its way underneath the mountain and got back underneath the very church that sat on top of it. And he came upon a passageway that was sealed off, that he couldn't get past. It had an inscription written in hieroglyphics on the wall, which he copied down. And he took this inscription back to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and had a Hebrew scholar translate it for him, and it came out to read, "Herein lies the golden ark of the covenant." Now, it was in hieroglyphics, and it was in Israel, which has never been found before, and it also was in Hebrew. Evidently, it was Hebrew hieroglyphics, which never existed, because after the words were translated into a sentence, "Herein lies the golden ark of the covenant," then their numerical value, you see Hebrew numbers have certain numerical values assigned each one of them, their numerical values were added up, and they equaled 1927. Conveniently enough for Futterer, because this was 1927 whenever he made this discovery. Well, there's no extant copy of this inscription that he allegedly found. No one has been able to find in the archives of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem any Hebrew professor, anyone else who translated some Hebrew hieroglyphic inscription for one Antonia Frederick Futterer. But that wasn't enough for someone who came just a few years ago. Futterer died. No one was very interested in his story to the point of pursuing it. And he had a close friend of his that became heir to all of the papers of Futterer. And then a couple of years ago, in October of 1981, a man who lives in Kansas, here in this country, got interested in the story, contacted the heir of Futterer's papers, did a little research and figuring out and calculations on his own, and decided that he would head illegally to Jordan, which is where Mount Nebo is found, and do a little archaeological research himself. I've got the article here in a magazine. I think I'll maybe point a few things out from it. Here's a picture of old Antonia Frederick Futterer. He looks like an archaeologist, ancient one back in Israel. And there's a title, such and such has found the Ark of the Covenant, or has he? He points out, interestingly enough, the author of the article, that this same man who found the ark, again, after Futterer had found the inscription, also found the city of Adam, the Tower of Babel, Noah's Ark, and a lot of other things. Which means either he's really made the rounds in the world, or he's got a fertile imagination to be claiming that he's found all of these things. But anyway, this man, one Tom Kreutzer, this was just a couple of years ago, October, I believe it was, 2 a.m. It even gives the exact moment. 2 a.m., October the 31st, 1981. He had found the same passageway, worked his way back, found a room that they had to break down this burying wall. They didn't see any inscriptions, by the way, but there was this barrier wall that was before it. They broke down this wall. In this chamber, they saw a rectangular box. The box was closed, and the explorers didn't touch it. They measured it, and it measured 62 inches long, 37 inches wide, and 37 inches high. In the corner of the chamber lay gauze-covered packages tied with leather thongs. Kreutzer took these to be the cherubim that once sat on the ark, but he didn't touch the packages. With their flash-equipped cameras, his group took color slides of what they had seen, and they left, returned to this country, reported it to the press, and finally UPI in Kansas got a hold of it. and wanted to do a story on it, wanted to get the pictures from Kreutzer. And Kreutzer said they could do the story, but he wouldn't give the pictures because God had revealed to him supernaturally that he was only to release the pictures to a London banker by the name of David Rothschild, who Kreutzer said was a direct descendant of Jesus Christ. I find that a little far-fetched, saying he never married. How we're going to have any direct descendants of his today? But anyway, he said, according to Kreutzer, Rothschild is the one that's going to rebuild the temple and maybe serve as a Messiah. I don't know. And Rothschild will have nothing to do with this fellow in Kansas. He doesn't want to talk about it. I guess he realizes he's not a descendant of Jesus Christ. But anyway, they finally did get a well-known archaeologist into the living room of this fellow who had the slides. And it reads kind of like the stories that we've told you in the past about the alleged discoveries of Noah's Ark. Always something came up, it seemed like. Someone had a picture of it, and then someone stole it, and they ended up dead in a swimming pool, and no one's been able to find their papers since. And someone spotted it from a helicopter, and they went back the next day, and it was gone. An avalanche had covered it, and all types of things that are very, very suspicious. Either, we have to believe one of several things. Either we have a lot of hoaxes perpetrated by a lot of people, amateur pop archaeologists today, self-appointed archaeologists today, or God doesn't want these things discovered, or it's just not time for them to be discovered. Now, one or all of those things may be true as far as we know concerning Noah's Ark, but not necessarily true concerning the Ark of the Covenant, as we'll show you here in a moment. So they sit down in the living room to look at all the pictures, and they go through one after another, and for some mysterious reason, they're all blurred. But they did get to the last one. These were color slides. They got to the last one that gives a clear front view of the box. And this archaeologist, a well-known archaeologist who visited this dear soul in Kansas, was a practiced draftsman himself, and although he wasn't allowed to take any pictures with him, he made a little sketch of it from memory, and he said it's got a lot of sheet metal on it that looked like it was metal that was machine worked, which means that it's something recent that someone stuck in there. It's not a very good picture, but here's what he saw on the front of it, or the front side of it, not the top of it. This is all he could see, and it was perfectly in these diamond-shaped forms around here. This is just a real rough sketch, but he evidently knew what he was talking about, and he said it looked like it had been done in, a machine shop, this metal, the way it had been tacked together and everything. So, no, that doesn't fulfill 2 Maccabees 2, someone finding the Ark of the Covenant, because no one's found the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant's mentioned over in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 19. I want to look at two passages. You need to get this information down, because if you haven't run into someone, you will, that wants to tell you about how someone's looking for the Ark of the Covenant. And they'll tell you that Jeremiah was the one who hid it in a cave. Ask them where they got that information. They'll probably be out of the same book where the angels are sicking horses to hoof people to death. Revelation, I don't know, that's my favorite account in the book, I guess. It just shows it too mystical for me. Revelation 11 and verse 19. And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, or the Ark of the Covenant. There were lightnings, voices, thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail. And so it's also been suggested, well, the reason we don't find the Ark of the Covenant mentioned back in the Old Testament was because God supernaturally took it to heaven, and here's the proof of that, because now it's in heaven. The problem with that is, verse 19 says the temple of God was open in heaven. That means he would have had to take Solomon's temple as well. We've got an Old Testament thing here, according to some people, the Ark of his testament. Well, what's the temple? That's the Old Testament too. If he took the Ark, then he had to have taken Solomon's temple. No, the correct understanding of that passage is that we're told even there in the book of Revelation, as well as in other places, that the things on earth are patterned after the things in heaven. I mean, God had his throne in heaven long before Solomon's had his on the earth. So whatever we're supposed to understand by the Ark of the Testament in Revelation 11:19 does not include taking it to mean the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament that was miraculously, bodily transported to heaven at the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. Whatever it means, we don't know because we're not given a lot of information about it. But it's something that was used by God in his instructions to Moses as a pattern for the Ark of the Covenant among the people of Israel. But then I guess the chief proof text against all this nonsense would be in Jeremiah's prophecy. Jeremiah, remember, was the one that hid it. But Jeremiah 3 in verse 16 is a proof text against 2 Maccabees 2 and the possibility of Jeremiah having hidden the Ark of the Covenant. Jeremiah 3. The reason we turn to his book is because he's the one who's supposed to have hidden it. And yet he's going to contradict that right here in these verses by telling the people, you don't need the Ark of the Covenant. What you need is God and holiness. You don't need these outward symbols. There's going to come a day when you don't have the outward symbols, and you're not even going to want to have the outward symbols. So why then would Jeremiah be hiding all of them? Jeremiah 3:16. And it shall come to pass, he's talking about whenever they're restored, the nation of Israel. It shall come to pass when ye be multiplied and increased in the land, in those days, saith the Lord, and this is one of the rare places that the Ark is mentioned in any books that come after the fall of Jerusalem. They shall say no more the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. That is, what he's showing here is people had a superstitious attachment to it. By just saying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, he said no more people are going to use that terminology anymore. No more are they going to be able to lay hold on the Ark for this, or swear by the Ark, or say that God is in our midst because the Ark is here. They had a lot of superstitious ideas in their mind attached to the presence of the Ark of the Covenant in their midst. It's kind of like with that brazen serpent of Moses that Hezekiah finally had to destroy. Old Nehushtan, the serpent, had been worshipped by the people. And so God's not going to restore something as physical as this so everyone can bow down before it, because this was the most important thing in Israel. We're supposed to have their holy law from Moses. And so people ask, what happened to the tables of the law then? Well, we're not told in the Bible. But they didn't go to heaven. God doesn't need literal tables in heaven. That was for people on the earth. I mean, I hope you're not naive enough to think that he's going to take a literal wooden box up there and set it in his temple. He's got one made out of we don't know what up there. He's got all types of things there. He can make one out of solid gold that doesn't need to be made out of wood and then overlaid with gold so you can hold it together. There are all types of things that could be done. But Jeremiah says, no more are you going to say the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Neither shall it come to mind, neither shall they remember it, neither shall they visit it, and neither shall that be done anymore. That's pretty definite. 4 neithers there. He said, we're forgetting about the Ark. The Ark is not what's necessary. We need God and his presence here. But the Ark doesn't guarantee that for us. It's our holiness and our righteousness, our obedience before him that'll secure his immediate presence in our midst. So what happened to it? We don't know. It was lost. It was destroyed. Babylonians took it and worshipped it over in Babylon, worshipped it as a god, stripped the gold, used that for something. We don't know. It's just not told, so there's no sense in speculating about it. That's where people get in trouble. Or there's no sense in writing a book, 2 Maccabees 2, so you can tell us what you think happened to the Ark. Or there's no sense in reading 2 Maccabees 2 and thinking, here's a great answer now. I've always wondered. Haven't some of you wondered before, what happened to the Ark of the Covenant? What happened to those tables of stone? Well, keep on wondering. Tell me if you find out. I probably won't trust you, though, because I'm going to want to know what Christian comic book did you get that out of? Because if God wanted us to know, it would be in the Bible. But Jeremiah was the one allegedly who hid it. And he said, it's not going to come into your mind. You won't remember it. You won't talk about it. You won't need it. So why hide it and say God's going to give it to us later on whenever he restores it? There'd be no need. It's a contradiction. So it boils down to this. Either you're going to believe 2 Maccabees 2 or Jeremiah 3. They're contradictory of each other. One assumes the future need for the ark, and one doesn't. Not just that it doesn't assume, it tells us that we won't need that in the future. So you have to believe one or the other. Either 2 Maccabees 2 or Jeremiah 3. Once you have that settled, then when you read archaeological magazine accounts about the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant, you can read it like a Christian comic book. It's a fun story. Some soul that's digging around over there at 2 in the morning, finding all types of hieroglyphic Hebrew inscriptions. It's fun to read. I enjoyed reading it several years ago. I remembered it whenever I started working on all this. I remember reading. Someone found that recently, didn't they? So I thought I'll look that up and get all of my details straight. Well, there's the most interesting, I guess, historical mistake in 2 Maccabees. And another thing I can mention about this, remember according to verse 4, he had the ark and the incense altar and the tabernacle. They didn't have the tabernacle. They had Solomon's temple. They had been without the tabernacle for 400 years. You're really off base now. He's putting us way back during the time of Moses, saying that Jeremiah took the tent of meeting. That's just another word for the tabernacle, Mosaic tabernacle, into this cave on top of the mountain. No, he'd have to carry Solomon's temple on a donkey if you're going to be right according to the history of the Old Testament, because it was Solomon's temple they were worshiping in, and not the Mosaic tabernacle. Okay, another error of the book. Spend enough time on that. You can fill up a page of notes on that. Remember those statistics for anyone in the future. Another error that we'll just point out in generalities, because we looked at all the verses last week, these many ghostly apparitions that are seen. That's simply not in line with the Bible. Yes, there are many times angelic appearances in the Bible and so forth, but this form of ghostly apparitions is simply not in line with the Scriptures. Okay, another fault. A man named Timotheus is killed in chapter 10 and verse 37. And yet the same man is still alive in chapter 12, verses 2 and following. And the chapters are in chronological order from 10 to 12, and this Timotheus is the same Greek individual. So he's killed in chapter 10 and verse 37, but we see him alive in chapter 12, verse 2 and following. Another error is that there is a 2-year instead of a 3-year lapse between the profanation of the temple and its rededication. According to 1 Maccabees, Antiochus entered the temple in 168 and profaned the place, and then it was rededicated under Judas Maccabeus in 165, a 3-year period. That's according to 1 Maccabees 4:52 with 1 Maccabees 1:54 and 59. 1 Maccabees 4:52 along with 1 Maccabees 1:54 and 59 tells us that it was a 3-year period between 168 and 165 when the temple was profaned by Antiochus and rededicated by Judas, which gave us the John 10:22 feast of dedication. But according to 2 Maccabees 10 and verse 3, it was a 2-year lapse, which is a historical mistake. Very obviously was wrong. 2 Maccabees 10 and verse 3. It's talking about Judas Maccabeus and his followers, how they recovered the temple, verse 1, in the city of Jerusalem, demolished the altars erected by the heathen in the public square, and their sacred precincts as well. When they had purified the sanctuary, they constructed another altar. Then striking fire from flints, they offered a sacrifice for the first time for 2 whole years. But it was 3 whole years, because it was from 25 Kislev until 25 Kislev, from 168 to 165. That means exactly 3-4 years. So here's a major mistake to say that it was only 2 years. Again, you have to either believe 1st Maccabees or 2nd Maccabees. It's not found in the Bible, friends. You have to believe one or the other of these books. And we've been repeating many times that 1st Maccabees is the more reliable of the two. Historically, religiously, and every other way, 1st Maccabees is going to be the book that's most reliable. So it's either a 2-year, 2 whole years, or 3 whole years. It can't be both. And he didn't say 2 years and 6 months or something. Even that would be wrong, because 1st Maccabees said 3 years to the very date, 3 years precisely. Well, that gives us enough errors tonight, because I've got a lot more and we'll get into next week then. So I guess we'll be on 2nd Maccabees again. See, there's a lot of material in 2nd Maccabees. It's an important book.